I never imagined a single letter could change everything I thought I knew about my family. For years, I worked two jobs, one at a diner during the day, another as a cleaner at night. Because my stepmother told me we couldn't afford to send both my stepsister and me to college. She convinced me that Sandy, my golden child stepsister, had more potential, and that it was my responsibility to support her. So I did. I worked, sacrificed, and watched from the shadows as she chased her dreams, while mine crumbled before I even had a chance to pursue them. I thought I had made peace with my role, but that was before I found the letter. It happened on a quiet afternoon while I was cleaning out my childhood bedroom. My stepmother was supervising the move to a smaller house, still managing to sound like she was doing me a favor. "Emily, don't forget to check the back of the closet," she called from downstairs, her voice carrying that usual blend of sweetness and control. With a sigh, I shoved an old box toward the door. I hadn't needed reminders to be thorough in years, but that was just her nature, always directing, always controlling. As I reached into the nearly empty closet, my fingers brushed against something wedged behind the baseboard. My heart thumped as I pulled out a yellowed envelope, worn with age. My name was scrawled across the front in familiar, careful handwriting, my father's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it, taking extra care not to tear the fragile paper inside. The moment I saw the date at the top, my breath hitched. It was written just weeks before he died. To my beloved daughter, Emily, if you are reading this, it means my wish has not been fulfilled. I asked your stepmother to give you the college fund I prepared for you, $50,000, set aside only for you. I hope this money helps you chase your dreams, the ones I know you've put on hold for too long. It pained me to see how often you were overlooked, how your stepmother favored Sandy at your expense. I hope, with this, you will finally reclaim your future. Stay strong, my bright girl. My vision blurred with tears. A college fund. My college fund. For years, my stepmother told me we were too broke to afford my education. She said I had to work, to contribute, to sacrifice. But my father had left me the money. He had planned for my future, and she had stolen it. I was still gripping the letter when I heard my stepmother's voice again, closer this time. "Emily?" I shoved the letter into my pocket just as her footsteps creaked on the stairs. My heart pounded, but I forced my voice to stay steady. "I'm here." When she entered, I pretended to be sorting through old documents. My fingers curled around the letter in my pocket like a lifeline. My father had tried to protect me, and now I finally knew the truth. I wasn't the obedient, forgotten daughter anymore. I was someone new, someone who wanted answers, and maybe, just maybe, someone who wanted justice. Dinner that night felt different. The air was thick with tension, but my stepmother and Sandy were oblivious. My stepmother was arranging the plates with her usual precision, while Sandy, curled up on her phone, barely acknowledged my existence. I sat at the table, the letter burning a hole in my pocket. My hands were damp with sweat. My heart pounded like a war drum in my chest. But I had to do this. "Today I found something interesting," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. My stepmother didn't even look up as she adjusted the silverware. A letter from Dad. That made her freeze. The silence that followed was deafening. Sandy finally glanced up from her phone, her brows furrowed. I pulled the letter from my pocket and placed it on the table. "It talks about a college fund. He left $50,000 for me." My stepmother turned slowly, but her face was unreadable. Her hands, however, trembled slightly. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice laced with faux concern. "Your father, well, he was confused before he passed. He made a lot of promises, but he wasn't thinking clearly." I swallowed the rage bubbling in my chest. The letter was written 2 weeks before he died. I pushed it forward. "It clearly states that the money had already been set aside." Sandy scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Do you seriously believe that? What, Dad just left you a secret fortune? Maybe a yacht too?" I turned to her, and for the first time, I saw it. Her complete and utter lack of remorse. My stepmother cleared her throat. "Emily, you understand how expensive college is. We had to make hard choices. Sandy had potential, and it was necessary to support her future. That was it. That was the final straw." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. What about my potential? I demanded, my voice shaking with emotion. I've been working nonstop, at the diner, cleaning houses, giving half my paycheck to this household, while Sandy gets to chase her dreams. And the whole time you had this money sitting there? My stepmother's mask cracked. Stop being so dramatic, she snapped, her voice sharp. We've all made sacrifices. Sandy needed things that were absolutely essential. Sandy gave me a smirk, but it wasn't as confident as before. It's not my fault you couldn't do well in school, she said casually. Someone in this family had to succeed. My breath caught in my throat. I turned to my stepmother, searching, desperate for even the slightest hint of regret. But there was nothing. She stood there, calm, composed, pretending none of this was a big deal. And in that moment I knew they would never apologize. They would never see me as an equal. They had stolen my future and erased its existence without a second thought. But I wasn't powerless anymore. I quietly picked up the letter, folding it carefully. My father's words echoed in my mind. Focus on the present. What's done is done. I met my stepmother's gaze. You're right, I said softly. What's done is done, but what happens next is up to me. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving them in stunned silence. I wasn't staying in this house a second longer. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my father's letter resting on my chest, my mind replaying the dinner over and over. The betrayal, the gaslighting, the sheer audacity of it all. By morning, my decision was made. I was leaving. I waited until my stepmother and Sandy went out for their usual Saturday brunch, a tradition I was never invited to. Then I packed. Not much, just a suitcase with some clothes, my important documents, and the small stack of cash I had managed to save from my diner shifts. My hands were shaking, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from exhaustion. It was from anticipation. Aunt Jody was my only escape route. She was my father's sister, and while she had never openly clashed with my stepmother, I always sensed she knew what was going on. She had been at the funeral, offering quiet comfort while my stepmother played the grieving widow. I called her. Jody, I need somewhere to go. A beat of silence. Then her voice, firm and steady. Come over, sweetheart. You're always welcome here. That was all I needed. I dragged my suitcase downstairs, my heart pounding. The house felt eerily silent without my stepmother's presence. The walls that had once trapped me now felt fragile, like they couldn't hold me back anymore. I took one last look around. Then I walked out. Aunt Jody lived in a cozy little cottage on the outskirts of town. It smelled like fresh-baked cookies and old books, the kind of warmth I had never known in my own home. When she opened the door, she didn't say anything. She just pulled me into a tight hug. And for the first time in years, I felt safe. After setting down my things, I pulled out my father's letter and handed it to her. She read it in silence, her lips pressing into a thin line. When she finished, she exhaled sharply and looked at me with something between anger and sorrow. You found it, she murmured. I frowned. You knew? Jody hesitated, then nodded. Your father made copies of everything. He asked me to keep them safe, just in case. In case of what? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. In case your stepmother did exactly what she did, Jody said bitterly. Then she disappeared into her study and returned a few minutes later with a thick folder. Inside were bank statements, legal documents, and even transcripts of conversations my father had recorded with my stepmother. And there it was, in black and white, evidence of the money he had set aside for me. It was far more than $50,000. My stepmother had drained everything, transferring it to a new account just months after my father died. He knew she might do this, Jody said, her voice thick with emotion. That's why he made me promise to keep records. I stared at the papers, my hands shaking. I had been working 2 jobs, breaking my back, giving them my paycheck, while my stepmother had stolen everything my father left for me. Rage boiled in my chest. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jody sighed. Your father told me to wait until you found the letter yourself. He believed you needed to be ready, to stand on your own before you could fight back. I clenched my fists. Well, I was ready now. A sudden noise from outside made us both turn. The sound of a car door slamming. Jody's face darkened. That's her. I walked to the window and peeked through the curtains. My stepmother was standing outside, talking to the neighbor like she had every right to be here. My stomach twisted. "If you're not ready to face her, you don't have to," Jody said softly. But I was already organizing the documents. My stepmother had taken everything from me. Now it was time to take it back. I stood by the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The thick folder of evidence in my hands suddenly felt heavier. Outside, my stepmother was still talking to the neighbor, but I could hear the edge in her voice, the calculated charm, the subtle manipulation. She wasn't here to apologize. She was here to take control. Jody looked at me. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" I met her gaze, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I have to be. I stepped forward and pulled the door open. My stepmother turned, startled for only a fraction of a second before slipping on her usual mask of feigned concern. "Emily," she exclaimed, stepping toward me like a mother welcoming her wayward daughter home. "I've been so worried. You left without a word, and we didn't know where you were." I raised an eyebrow. "You froze my bank account the day after I left? You knew exactly where I was." Her expression faltered. Sandy was standing a few feet behind her, arms crossed, looking irritated. She didn't seem nearly as confident as she had at the dinner table. "We need to talk," my stepmother said smoothly, stepping toward me. I didn't move. Instead, I held up the folder in my hands. "Oh, we're going to talk. But first, I have a question." I opened the folder and pulled out the bank statements, the ones proving that she had drained my father's account and transferred everything to a new one. "Where's my money?" Her face drained of color so fast I almost felt bad for her. "Almost? Emily, you don't understand." "No," I cut her off, my voice sharp. "I understand perfectly. Dad left money for me, for my future, and you stole it." A muscle in her jaw twitched. She wasn't used to being confronted. "That money was meant for the family," she said, her voice taking on a lecturing tone. "You don't understand the sacrifices we had to make." I laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. "Sacrifices? You mean the 2 jobs I worked while Sandy went to school on my money?" Sandy finally spoke up, her arms still crossed. "Oh, come on, Emily. You act like you were some helpless victim. You agreed to work. No one forced you." I turned to her, my stomach twisting with disgust. "I agreed because I thought we didn't have a choice. I agreed because I trusted you, because I thought we were a family." For the first time, Sandy looked uncomfortable, but my stepmother wasn't ready to give up. She straightened her spine, regaining her composure. "Emily," she said, her voice carefully measured, "I was going to return the money. We just needed it for a little while. You wouldn't have used it properly anyway. You never had the drive Sandy did." My grip on the folder tightened. "You mean I never had the chance to?" I shot back. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Listen to me," she said, her voice dangerously low. "This doesn't have to be a fight. If you just come home, we can fix this. You don't have to struggle on your own. We can put this behind us." "No," I said simply. Her eyes flashed. "Excuse me?" I stepped forward, my voice steady. "You don't get to control me anymore. You don't get to use me, manipulate me, steal from me, and then act like I should be grateful for it." I held up my father's letter. "Dad believed in me, even when you didn't. And now, I believe in myself too." For the first time, real panic flickered in her eyes. She wasn't used to me standing up for myself. "You are making a mistake," she said through clenched teeth. "You think you can survive without us? Without my help?" I smiled. "Watch me." She stared at me for a long moment, then exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Fine, do whatever you want, but don't come crawling back when you realize how cruel the world is." I met her gaze without blinking. "I'd rather struggle alone than live under your control ever again." She turned on her heel and stormed toward the car. Sandy hesitated, her eyes flickering between me and our mother. I saw something in her face, something that almost looked like regret. But then she scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "You'll regret this," she muttered. And then they were gone. As the car disappeared down the road, Jody placed a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" she asked softly. I let out a shaky breath. "Yeah." For the first time in years, I really was. The moment my stepmother and Sandy drove away, I felt something I hadn't in years. Relief. For the first time, I wasn't trapped under their expectations, their manipulation, their control. But the battle wasn't over yet. They had stolen from me, and I wasn't just going to let them get away with it. Jody sat down at the kitchen table, tapping the folder of evidence. We need to take this to a lawyer. I swallowed hard, nodding. I had never dealt with lawyers before, but if I wanted justice, I had to do this. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Sandy. Mom's in the hospital. She had a panic attack from the stress. Hope you're happy. I stared at the message for a long time. Then, without replying, I deleted it. I refused to feel guilty for finally standing up for myself. Jody's lawyer, Mr. Lawson, was an older man with kind eyes but a sharp mind. After reviewing the documents, he leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk. Your stepmother is in serious trouble, he said. Forgery, theft, misappropriation of funds. We can take her to court. How long would it take? I asked, my throat dry. Could be months, even years. But don't worry, Emily. You have a solid case. I exhaled slowly. This was going to be a long fight, but I wasn't backing down. Lawson filed the necessary paperwork. My stepmother was formally served with legal notice a week later. The texts started pouring in, first from distant relatives who were suddenly concerned, then from Sandy, who was furious that I had the nerve to go after our family. But the one message that stuck with me came from my stepmother herself. You ungrateful brat. You're ruining us. Do you really think you'll win? You're nothing without me. I stared at the message, my stomach twisting. Then I blocked her number. I wasn't scared of her anymore. While the lawsuit was pending, I had to figure out how to survive. With my stepmother freezing my bank account, I was left with only the cash I had saved. It wasn't much. Rent was due, tuition payments were coming up, and my hours at the diner had been cut. One evening, I was scrubbing the diner's counters when Sandy walked in. I stiffened, gripping the rag in my hand. She slid onto a stool at the counter, looking me dead in the eyes. You have to drop this. I scoffed. Not happening. Mom is barely holding on. We might lose the house. Is that what you want? I set down the rag, leaning forward. You mean the house that was paid for with my college fund? Her jaw clenched. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. I shot back. Sandy exhaled, her expression shifting. For the first time, she looked uncertain. I didn't know about the money, she admitted. I mean, I knew things were tight, but I didn't know Mom had taken everything from you. I didn't respond. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Look, maybe you win in court, but is it really worth destroying Mom over? Is revenge really that important to you? I leaned in, keeping my voice calm but firm. This isn't about revenge, it's about justice, about getting back what was stolen from me. Mom destroyed herself the moment she decided to steal my future. Sandy stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she stood up and left. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to chase after her. The lawsuit dragged on for nearly a year. My stepmother fought tooth and nail, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge ruled in my favor. She was ordered to repay the stolen money. She didn't have it. The house was seized. Her assets were liquidated. Sandy had to drop out of her master's program. My stepmother, who had never worked a day in her life, got a job as a cashier at a grocery store. The same woman who had once sneered at my diner job was now bagging groceries to survive. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was free. A year later, I was in the university library studying for my final exams. My phone buzzed. A message from Jody. I found another letter from your dad. It was tucked inside his old book. Want to come pick it up? My heart clenched. That evening, I drove to Jody's and she handed me an old, worn copy of Jane Eyre, my father's favorite book. Inside, I found a small yellowed photograph. It was of my father, young and beaming, holding the key to his first apartment. On the back, he had written, "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. Now it's your turn." Tears burned my eyes as I traced the words with my fingers. My phone buzzed again. A message from Sandy. Can we talk? I hesitated, staring at the screen. Maybe she had changed. Maybe she hadn't. Either way, it didn't matter. I had finally chosen myself, and for the first time in my life, I was free.